After the fall of the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s, there was a fracturing amongst the American right. Some true conservatives realized that at the end of the Soviet Union, there was no great threat to American hegemony across the world, and that the United States should cease its efforts to become an empire and should instead return to being a republic. The enemy was defeated. They were no more. There was no one left to fight. At this time, American libertarians such as Justin Raimondo and Murray Rothbard realized that there was an opening. People like Justin Raimondo worked with people like Patrick Buchanan, who emulated those values of the old right, and worked with them to create an anti-war coalition. Now, Justin Raimondo was specifically prophetic in his realization toward the end of the 90s that China was becoming the new Soviet Union in terms of the American empire and an enemy of the American empire. And he wrote a column in June of 1999 discussing this turn towards China. Today on the Liberty Weekly podcast, we're going to be taking a look at this column that Justin Raimondo wrote, China in the New Cold War, and talk a little bit about how prophetic it was and continues to be as we're in the middle of a crisis regarding Taiwan and a general renewed great power competition, or Cold War 2.0, that Justin predicted about 20 years ago. So the show notes for this episode will be found at libertyweekly.net/230. This is episode 230, and I am your host, Patrick McFarlane. I am the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute, which you can find at libertarianinstitute.org. As I said, you can find my work at libertyweekly.net, and you can find my newsletter and membership website at libertyweekly.club. You can sign up for the free emails, or you can also sign up as a supporting member to receive bonus content and early access to my work. One of the reasons why I wanted to focus on this column is because Justin Raimondo is someone who had supported Patrick Buchanan a lot through the 1990s, through Patrick Buchanan's presidential run, and had actually had written a book, Reclaiming the American Right, talking about how libertarians could join up with isolationist conservatives, because these isolationist paleo-conservatives were people who emulated the values of the old right, which is a coalition of scholars and people who came together to oppose the New Deal in the 1930s and oppose the United States entry into World War II. And this is where Murray Rothbard had derived a lot of the genealogy of the modern libertarian movement as it progressed through the last 100 years. He really identified libertarians as being the ideological ancestors of this old right. And that's why it was so significant in 1999 when Justin Raimondo came out with a column talking about how Patrick Buchanan and other figures had become very hawkish on China specifically. And I think I am actually working on a column right now talking about Justin's specific treatment of Patrick Buchanan, seeing that all through the 90s he had been a very ardent supporter of Patrick Buchanan and continued to be through 1999, specifically with Buchanan's treatment or opposition to U.S. involvement in Kosovo. And I think that we have a lot to learn about how Raimondo treated Patrick Buchanan, because there were so many things that Patrick Buchanan was good on, and there were, one glaring thing that he was very bad on, specifically isolationist trade practices, anti-free trade with China, and being overall hawkish on China, that I think Justin specifically calling that out very loudly, but also maintaining his ardent support for Buchanan is a lesson that we can learn from when we tried to talk about the populist right and their opposition to U.S. involvement in Ukraine and being dovish on Russia while simultaneously being very hawkish on China. And in that piece, I kind of talk a little bit about how the new right, do they really emulate these values that we hold so highly that the old right had? And so does the populist right maintain those values? But in reviewing this piece that I think is so prophetic by Justin Raimondo, really 20 years ahead of his time, 24 years almost ahead of his time, China and the New Cold War. So he begins by saying the burst of good old-fashioned isolationism on the right that followed the implosion of communism and the end of the Cold War is in danger of sputtering to an abrupt halt. From Pat Buchanan to Gary Bauer to the congressional Republican leadership, just about every political leader and ideologue of a conservative hue has been snookered by a concerted campaign to demonize China as the new evil empire, a grand coalition that spans the spectrum from the AFL-CIO to the American Conservative Union is beating the drums for war with China. The labor unions want a trade war, as does Buchanan. The neoconservatives are naturally in favor of any war, so long as it serves their vision of a foreign policy that frankly aims at world hegemony, as Weekly Standard editor Bill Kristol likes to put it. Some religious right leaders, notably Bauer, having despaired of ever abolishing the National Endowment for the Arts, and otherwise largely ignored by the Republican congressional leadership, have signed on to the holy war against Red China, alleging anti-Christian persecution. The Hollywood crowd, steeped in New Age mysticism and enamored of Tibetan Buddhism, is waging a war of images, with xenophobic movies such as Kudun. Bootlegged videos have flooded the Chinese market, and the movie moguls are miffed. This, combined with Tinseltown's penchant for stagey self-righteousness, has propelled the glitzy and the glamorous into the front ranks of the China haters. So I think we can see a lot of parallels to what modern parallels to what Raimondo is talking about at the time. This fascination with Tibet really is kind of echoed in the Uyghur issue today. And this talking about anti-Christian persecution being alleged against the Chinese is also kind of emulated in the Uyghur issue, but also with this issue of alleged organ harvesting and the Falun Gong being a New Age UFO cult that has moved to the United States, that I've covered in my work before, has moved to the United States and is setting up publications like New Tang Dynasty and the Epoch Times, pandering to conservative outlets by publishing a lot of pro-Trump stuff, but a lot of anti-PC woke kind of stuff, red meat for conservatives that they are just starved for because they don't really get it in the mainstream news media. So they turn to people like the Falun Gong Epoch Times to get that. The xenophobes almost never, this is Raimondo again, the xenophobes almost never refer to China as simply China, but instead raise the specter of Red China or Communist China. Of course, it was, and this is important to all you listening, of course, China was never called Red China during the halcyon days of the Cold War, during the era of Mao Zedong, when China was in the throes of cultural revolution, which was a mass ideological exorcism in which bourgeois capital roaders within the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, were sent to re-education camps, and peasants were forced to live in agricultural communes in which they worked, ate, and slept together like a vast hive of worker bees. For Mao had not only broken with the Kremlin, but deemed the Soviet social imperialists far more dangerous than the United States. Nixon's trip to China signaled the beginning of a wide-ranging strategic and military alliance between the two nations. While a very few conservatives rallied around their old ally Taiwan, most proclaimed Nixonian diplomacy a stroke of genius, and from that moment no more was heard about human rights violations in China until well after the end of the Cold War. So this again has a great modern parallel, because of course you never heard about red communist China during the actual Cold War, and that was because China had split with Russia, and at the time it was strategically more important to close an eye on the horrors of communist China. And we can see, now it is different, that China is called Red China all the time. And this really kind of started in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. So how red is China? And this is important, and I think that these things that Raimondo highlights in these articles have only really continued since he wrote it in 1999. So just how communist is China after Deng Xiaoping? The reforms. After Richard Nixon raised his glass in salute to the People's Republic, Red China dropped entirely out of the conservative lexicon. The great problem in reviving it is that a wave of reform has washed the redness out of China so thoroughly that it is today not even barely discernible pink. Since the death of Mao in 1979 and the ascension of Deng Xiaoping as China's new, quote, great helmsman, China has shed Marxist orthodoxy in all but the formal sense. Far from promoting Marxist ideology or serving as the center of a revived worldwide commie conspiracy, the Chinese Communist Party is presiding over the largest scale destatization process ever attempted in, quote, constructing socialism with Chinese characteristics, as they put it. The heirs of Mao in the Long March are systematically dismantling the economic foundations of socialism, selling off state industries, not only allowing but actively soliciting foreign investment, privatizing land, cutting back on the military, setting up special economic zones in which the deadening hand of the party and the bureaucracy is stayed and the market allowed to flourish virtually unhampered. These and a host of other radical measures have effectively abolished the economic dictatorship of the party and the state. The dour spirit of Maoist egalitarianism, which exhorted China to, quote, put politics in command, has given way to a new form of socialism, quote, summed up by Deng in famous maxim, quote, to get rich is glorious. So this is something that I talked about with James Corbett on a past episode. And the title of that episode is Backdoor to China, libertyweekly.net/170, where we talked about foreign investment in China during the conversion to being more of a capitalist state, to the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. And we talked about a meeting that was had during during that time of U.S. banking interests and Wall Street putting its money behind these reforms in China, and after China's opened up for investment, how that occurred. So he covered that on, let's see, I have a bunch of links there in libertyweekly.net/170. Deal with the Devil, How Did the Global Elite Recolonize China? Let's see. Yeah, and a few more. Let's see. Echoes of World War I, China, the U.S., and the Next Great War. And James Corbett's episode 297, China in the New World Order, which is where he talks about that banking meeting that happened during the reforms. So Raimondo continues, while Chinese Marxist theoreticians insist on referring to their system as, quote, market socialism, it is no more socialist than the economies of Europe and the United States, and no less. In many respects, the burgeoning Chinese private sector is far less regulated than in the West. China has no civil rights laws, no Chinese with Disabilities Act, no affirmative action. Western commentators of the liberal persuasion bemoan the lack of, quote, social welfare measures, such as workmen's compensation, and demand that Chinese be given the alleged right to organize unions. China, the Invisible Empire, is another section of Raimondo's article. At the end of Deng Xiaoping's life, in the final throes of his struggle against the remaining orthodox Maoists in the CCP leadership, the aging leader took to the stump and made his case to the Chinese people, traveling throughout South China and touring the special economic zones. He argued forcefully for more rapid privatization and the unleashing of market forces, as Orville Schell puts in his book The Mandate of Heaven, which I actually have right here. Deng's Nanxiang Southern Tour had rammed Chinese society into reverse gear, stampeding the country into a form of unregulated capitalism that made the U.S. and Europe seem almost socialist by comparison. With the standard of living and growth rates rapidly rising, ordinary Chinese have never been better off, but that does not satisfy the human rights crowd. Far from it. China may be taking the capitalist road, they carp, but it is still a long way from achieving quote unquote democracy. This obsession with capital D democracy overshadowed Clinton's trip to China and so skewed the focus of the American media and ultimately the president himself that the main subject of public discussion was not the dramatic achievements of the post-Mao destatization in which a billion people lifted themselves out of serfdom. Instead, the president engaged in an hour-long colloquy with Chinese Premier Jiang Zemin on the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident, in which a few hundred rioters bent on self-immolation achieved their stated ends. So, Raimondo, he spends a great deal of this article talking about the Tiananmen Square incident, and I actually, for that reason, I bought and read a book that he cites in this article, and I have a few more examples that he provides of the fact that the protesters, the student protesters in the Tiananmen Square incident were bent on committing suicide via the state, and that they actually wanted to be killed by the Chinese Communist Party. And we're going to get into that. Of course, it doesn't excuse any killing that did take place, that the Chinese Communist Party and the PLA did take the lives of citizens. It doesn't necessarily excuse that, but I think it's a huge thing that is left out of the story, because the Tiananmen Square incident is one of the largest things that anyone has ever heard about the Chinese Communist Party. And I think no image of China is completely correct without knowing, at least having heard of the other side of it. And most people really haven't heard anything about Tiananmen Square aside that it was a massacre and something about the tank man, right? So it's very important. Another note is that I believe, I know it was Lew Rockwell who has talked a lot about not being a China hawk, and has talked a lot about the incredible reforms that took place in China, lifting almost a billion people out of serfdom, absolute poverty. And really, that is a huge testament to the power of market capitalism. And that is something that is always left out of the picture of China that people in the United States have. And I'm not going to spend, we're not really going to get to a comprehensive analysis of what happened at Tiananmen and the Western story about what happened at Tiananmen in this episode, but just to go through Raimondo's take on it and to offer a few more quotations. So Raimondo says, "The myth of Tiananmen. The Tiananmen Square massacre, in quotes, is an incident so wrapped up in mythology, most of it generated by Western journalists and their professional dissident friends, that it is nearly impossible for any revisionist analysis to be given a hearing. The world saw the goddess of democracy, the bright banners and youthful idealism of the protesters, a giant rock concert held under the gaze of the seemingly incongruous Chairman Mao, whose gargantuan portrait dominates the square. Indelibly etched on the popular mind is the image of a lone man standing in the path of an oncoming tank. The tank moves to the left and then to the right, in a fruitless effort to avoid flattening him. This sequence of events could serve as a kind of shorthand for the events leading up to the infamous incident. Ensconced in the square for weeks on end, the students were at first hailed by the radical reform wing of the CCP, and even some of the more orthodox, as the harbingers of a new spirit of, quote, socialist democracy. Hui Quili, the party chieftain in charge of press and propaganda at the time, was in sympathy with the students' democratic demands and gave the go-ahead to the media to open up and begin to report what was happening in the square. The students were duly rewarded with a front-page photo and a adulatory news story in the May 5th issue of the official People's Daily. That is why those discount the recent student-led protests against the bombing of China's Belgrade embassy as government-staged and therefore of limited significance miss the point completely. So Justin's referring to the U.S. bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in Serbia, Kosovo, and that's what he's talking about. and it was largely poo-pooed by people who would normally champion the student protesters during Tiananmen Square. So he says, again, that is why those discount the recent student-led protests against the bombing of Belgrade's embassy as government staged and therefore of limited significance. That's why those people miss the point completely. These analysts are forgetting that the most significant rebellion against the authority of the CCP was praised and to a large extent engineered by a very wing of the CCP bureaucracy. So, I mean, he's saying here that there was a party chieftain who had actually allowed the media to be reporting on the student protests in Tiananmen Square, and it was as if the size, because in reading Mandate of Heaven, it wasn't until after the student protesters started to get media attention that thousands, tens of thousands of people in Beijing actually started to sympathize with their cause and started to get involved. The Tiananmen Square incident wasn't confined to the square itself. It actually, there were tens of thousands of people in Beijing who got into the streets and actually aided the student protesters by blocking PLA army soldiers and police from getting to the square to disperse the crowds. And this was all allowed by the CCP leadership, because if the media coverage wasn't allowed, no one really, knowledge about the event really wouldn't have been widespread, and you probably wouldn't have gotten the involvement that you did in the general population. And indeed, a great deal of the actual violence at Tiananmen Square didn't take place in the square itself. It took place as citizens from Beijing were confronting the PLA soldiers who were marching and trying to get to the square. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But the CCP, listen to the other side of the story. The CCP says that the killing of citizens in Beijing actually didn't start until the citizens started being violent and massacring these columns of soldiers who were marching to the square. Now, do we believe straight up what the CCP says about what happened? No, but we don't straight up believe what the students and what the liberal West and journalists have to say exactly about what happened there. I think the truth really is somewhere in the middle, and that it probably was a very chaotic event. And in some cases, you have citizens protesting who approached the PLA and who got violent with the PLA. Maybe there was some confusion. There were shots fired at several locations, and panic ensued. But the one-sided story of the protesters and the Western media was that the PLA were provoked and just started massacring citizens and were chasing them down and shooting them in the back as they were running away. Now, you have two very different versions of events here, and I can't sit here and tell you exactly what happened because I wasn't there. And so I don't know what happened, but I would suspect that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So, getting back to the article here. On May 18th, the Daily pushed Gorbachev's visit to a small item below the fold and ran six front-page stories on the student protest. Headlines blared, 1 million from all walks of life demonstrate in support of hunger-striking students. Quote, save the students, save the children. Other newspapers in different areas of the country joined the chorus. In Guangming Daily, the Guangming Daily came out with seven front-page stories on the tumultuous events in Beijing and proclaimed, quote, the conditions of the students and the future of the country touch the heart of every Chinese who has a conscience. So he's referring to, there was a visit by Gorbachev to Beijing for what at the time was a major diplomatic visit. However, even though that visit by Gorbachev was incredibly important, that story was pushed to a small item below the fold of the newspaper, and even the newspapers, which were largely controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, put out tons of stories that were incredibly sympathetic to the student movement. And at the time, you have here's a picture here, you have students that are in the square that are hunger striking and are basically, I mean, throwing themselves and refusing to eat to the point of starvation. They're passing out, and there are these incredibly dramatic displays of of these students who are just weak and feeble and are refusing to eat. And one thing you have at the beginning, Justin really talks about how it was seemingly incongruous that there was a rock concert being held in Tiananmen Square in front of Chairman Mao. And one thing he's kind of getting at that is that the students in the square were actually invoking the communist, you know, Mao Zedong, but also other communist leaders from the USSR, talking and invoking that to try to appeal to the Chinese Communist Party, appealing to those roots to say that no, we are actually the people, we are the proletariat, and that the leaders of the CCP have become just another capitalist ruling class. So the West always talks about democracy, capital D democracy, that the students were largely protesting for some kind of liberal freedom. You talk about the liberal rules-based world order. It's always, Tiananmen Square is always used that the students were protesting there for some kind of libertarian kind of freedom movement, capital D democracy, right? While in reality, many of them were actually there invoking these communist leaders, and true enough that they were actually in some of them were actually asking for more liberal treatment, like freedom of speech and things like that, and some of them actually were invoking Western, like libertarianish, classical liberal leaders, but a great number of them, I would say probably the vast majority of them, were invoking. And again, it seems to me that they were invoking these old communist, like these pure communist values, to say that we are the people, we are the proletariat, and the Chinese Communist Party and the cronies have just basically become another capitalist ruling class. And I think that Justin talks a bit more about that here. So he says the myth of monolithism. American commentators were surprised that the Jian Zemin Clinton debate on the meaning of Tiananmen was broadcast live over the state-controlled television network. So again, Raimondo is referring to a debate between Bill Clinton and the current Chinese leader Jian Zemin, and American commentators were surprised that the debate was actually broadcast over state media, Chinese state media. Their astonishment is equaled only by their ignorance. The Chinese media has been relatively open for some time. Since the communist regime was installed in 1949, the media has been a battleground in the ceaseless factional conflicts within the Communist Party, and to a certain extent in the country at large. Mao's 100 Flowers campaign, followed by vicious repression, made ordinary Chinese wary of such opening up. Yet the Cultural Revolution, a paroxysm of violence and collective madness, was ushered in by an article in the Chinese press and orchestrated by an extensive media campaign that targeted the Communist Party itself as the seedbed of capitalism reborn. So again, I talked about a little bit earlier how all the press had come out and supported the students. A lot of the press had, but again, Raimondo's saying that it's not that the CCP had monolithic control over the press. It's that, of course, there's factions within the CCP, some of which do control the press and were in large support of what the students were doing. Before the Tiananmen Square crackdown, the media was in the hands of reformers and was bold enough to broadcast party chieftain Xiao Ziyang's indiscreet remarks to Gorbachev during the latter's visit that Deng, although without any official post, was really at the helm. So he's referring to the fact that during this time, Deng Xiaoping had officially stepped down and his replacement had come in, but unbeknownst to everyone else, Deng Xiaoping was still in control. He was just wasn't in control in name. He was behind the scenes controlling everything. In 1989, at the height of the turmoil, the top leadership of the CCP met with the student rebels. The entire proceedings were broadcast nationwide by CCTV. It is as if during the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968 that Mayor Daley and Hubert Humphrey had agreed to negotiate with Mark Rudd, Bernadine Dorn, and Abby Hoffman while the cameras rolled. So again, he's just saying that the student protests got widespread, very sympathetic coverage from the press, and the party leadership actually had agreed to meet with the leaders of the student protests who had spent, more than a week basically immolating themselves in Tiananmen Square by starving themselves. They had been on TV. There was coverage of this through the newspapers. But the very fact that these protesters, these radical student protesters, got an actual audience with the CCP leadership, and that it was broadcast to the entire nation on TV, is remarkable, right? The Chinese New Left is the next section of Raimondo's piece here. In understanding the politics and style of the Tiananmen Square protesters, the New Left analogy is useful, for these were leftists in a Chinese context in their ideology as well as in their provocative style. So here Raimondo's referring to the New Left as the student movements like the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, during the Vietnam War. So he's making that comparison, of course, to an audience in 1999 who would be very familiar with that term, the New Left. So he again, the whole point of going through this is to illustrate that the reality of the student movement at the time and the reality of Tiananmen Square is not that these students were as sympathetic as the liberal media in the United States was portraying them to be, as some kind of freedom fighters or something like that. The reality is more complicated and it's different, right? So from the very beginning, the student rebels marched into the square singing the Internationale and toting portraits of Mao. According to Li Fengyan's pro-student protester account, the meaning of Tiananmen, which I have the book, it's on my shelf right here, just haven't gotten a chance to read it yet, but Raimondo says the leaders of a prominent student group, according to Li Feng, let me redo that. According to Li Fengyan's pro-student according to Li Feigon's pro-student protester account of the meaning of Tiananmen, the leaders of a prominent student group who, in alliance with city workers, organized the Beijing Workers' Autonomous Trade Union. They hung big pictures, so the student protesters hung big pictures of Mao in the tents they pitched on the square. They talked openly and boldly about the good old days of the Cultural Revolution. Mao, they felt, had the right ideas, although he sometimes used the wrong tactics. Now they were determined to use what they considered the right ones. So again, this is what I was talking about earlier with exactly what these student protesters were invoking when they went into the square. It wasn't Thomas Jefferson, largely wasn't, like overwhelmingly wasn't Thomas Jefferson. Now, again, I can't say that there weren't some people there who were invoking Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine or some kind of American classical liberal revolutionaries, but largely they were invoking the good old days of the Cultural Revolution and Chairman Mao. Those tactics were as confrontational as any employed by any band of yippies that ever marched through the streets of American cities in the 60s. The leadership of the student movement was fractious and rarely spoke in a single voice, but the selected supreme commander of the Tiananmen Square encampment, Chai Lin, carried much moral authority, and it was largely through her influence that thousands of students failed to evacuate the square even after word had reached them, reportedly from Deng Xiaoping's son, Deng Pufang, that the tanks were rolling. So, again, and this is cited here in Mandate of Heaven, that the son of Deng Xiaoping notified the student protesters in Tiananmen Square a day or two before the quote-unquote massacre that the tanks were rolling in to kill them all, basically. And so I'm actually going to read the quote from Mandate of Heaven, and One of the big reasons for doing this, because of course I'm probably going to be accused of being some kind of Communist Party sympathizer or propagandist or provocateur or something, for even giving this viewpoint. Of course, I'm doing so in the same vein that Justin Raimondo would, who is far from, as I am, very far from any kind of communist sympathizer. But Orville Schell, the writer of this book, is actually very anti-Communist Party of CCP, Chinese Communist Party, and this accounting is largely very pro-student. But he writes on page 127, as the week progressed, however, there were more and more hints that the government had not given up hope of militarily reoccupying the city. On May 22nd, Deng Xiaoping's son, Deng Pufang, was rumored to have dispatched representatives to the square to warn of another military assault and counsel protesters to retreat quickly if they wished to avoid bloodshed. Such ominous signals left the student leadership more divided than ever, fearing that the hardliners would be harsher than ever after their embarrassing failure. They had previously attempted to clear the square and failed, where Kai Tzi and Wang Dan urged the students to declare victory and stage a tactical retreat. However, Chai Ling, who had been, quote, elected to the grandiose position of commander-in-chief of Tiananmen Square Unified Action Headquarters, remained committed to, quote, defending the square at all costs. Quote, each day and hour that we stay here, we make more people around the country aware that there are people in China who still dare to resist and to cry out that they are no longer willing to be slaves, was the way Chai's husband, Fang Kongdi, put it. Okay, here's another quote from Chai Ling from, I think it was around April 15th. So this is like 2 weeks later. So as ever, Commander-in-Chief Chai Ling remained possessed by her vision of grim and bloody apocalypse, as if any sacrifice less than death demeaned the cause. Quote, the next step is bloodshed, she had said, shortly before the goddess of democracy was erected in the square. Only when the square is washed in blood will the people of the whole country wake up. The day the soldiers enter the city, then the blood of the people will flow, declared one banner flying outside of the square. Here's another statement by Chai Ling. We knew that the purification of the Republic, this is page 151, we knew that the purification of the Republic could only be achieved by our sacrifice. Not wanting to be responsible for deciding the fates of her classmates, Chai took the position that each person must decide for himself whether to leave the square. She herself would remain. Quote, we were ready to receive the butcher's knives in peace. We knew that the moment had come for us to lay down our lives for the nation. Such passionate declarations of willingness to sacrifice made it psychologically extremely difficult for others to discuss tactical retreat without appearing to advocate capitulation. Now, there is an account of the book of one of the hunger strikers who had decided, when things were getting really hairy in the square, to try to convince some other student protesters from leaving the square before they were all killed. His name was Zhu Duo. And this is a quote from page 152 of Mandate of Heaven. Back at the monument, Hu tried to gather the students together. A tape made by a German journalist of the chaotic debate that ensued recorded the following, quote, we cannot remain here anymore, pleaded Hu. Students and citizens, I dare to say that our movement has succeeded and has won a great victory, but now we must leave this place. None of us fears death, but our deaths must serve some purpose. No, no, voices countered. Students, if we can save even one more drop of blood now, there will be much more hope for the future of our march forward, Zhu implored. We cannot use fists against soldiers armed with rifles and bayonets. We must now try to save ourselves. Quote, if you want to achieve democracy, we must start now with ourselves. The minority should listen to the majority, interjected Liu Zuobo, who only a short time earlier had been urging people to remain in the square as a form of sacrificial atonement. As 5 o'clock neared, Hu was close to despair. Columns of troops and rows of APCs were approaching the monument, and rifle fire aimed at student loudspeakers was growing intense, and he feared the students would take the advance as a sign that the military command had gone back on its promise to allow a retreat. Quote, "Please blame me for this if you want. Please blame the four of us who cried out over the students' feeble sound system. As long as you leave the square safely, you can do whatever you want to us." A feverish last-minute effort to take a voice vote followed, during which militant students who had already resigned themselves to dying strenuously opposed Hu's last-minute appeal. "If we must die, let's die together. You fascist running dogs. They're shooting at the loudspeakers." Frankly, I couldn't tell which side was louder, Hu admitted afterwards. It was the kind of situation where those who wanted to leave were not speaking up, and those who didn't want to leave were quite loud. Finally, I didn't bother with the vote and simply told everyone to leave. So, of course, you have a situation here where it's not all monolithic, and, of course, every individual is an individual, but you have a large consignment of the students there refusing to leave the square and resigned to their fate of dying in that square. So, back here, another section head by Justin Raimondo, A Chinese Jonestown. That Chailin welcomed death and that the actions of her and her hardcore followers amounted to a mass suicide is clearly expressed by the, quote, Supreme Commander herself in an interview conducted in late May just before the crackdown. Quote, "Some fellow students asked me what our plans are, what our demands will be in the future. This made me feel sick at heart. I started out to tell them that what we were waiting for was the spilling of the blood. I started out to tell them that what we were waiting for was actually the spilling of blood, for only when the government descends to the depths of depravity and decides to deal with us by slaughtering us, only when the rivers of blood flow in the square, will the eyes of our country's people truly be opened." Here's a citation here Raimondo provided. Even as more reasonable student leaders like Weir Coxie argued, and my apologies as always with the pronunciation of these names, that's very difficult, argued that the students, having made their point, should withdraw from the square and live to fight another day. Chailin, quote, the Supreme Commander, commanded her followers to stay and wait for martyrdom. Already embarked on a hunger strike that had weakened and even completely debilitated many students, they passively obeyed their fanatical commander. In style and spirit, the massacre at Tiananmen Square is closer to Jonestown than to a crusade for freedom. Like the American New Left of the 60s, the Chinese New Left movement that reached its flaming apogee in Tiananmen Square employed radically dramatizing means to achieve egalitarian and, quote, revolutionary ends. They, too, held high the banner of Chairman Mao. Like the Weathermen faction of SDS, Chailin and her hardcore supporters not only expected repression, but openly hoped that their actions would provoke it. Roots of the movement. As Eric Margulies, foreign affairs editor of the Toronto Sun, so trenchantly put it, the Tiananmen Square massacre, quote, has become a cause célèbre among the fashionable leftists and literati who have never forgiven China's rulers for abandoning socialism. This reaction to the policies of Deng and his successors was not limited to the West. It was reflected not only in the Maoist sympathies of some Chinese students, but also in the broad demands put forward by the student movement. Aside from vague assertions about the need for democracy, the more concrete details of the students' program were remarkably pedestrian. At the height of the reforms, with government subsidies to students cut to the bone, intellectuals saw their incomes stay stagnant or even decrease at a time when relatively uneducated peasants were going into business and following Deng's maxim to get gloriously rich. While insisting on their right to march and to free speech, the students also demanded, quote, more money for education and higher pay for intellectuals. And he cites Li Feigon's book. Jeez. So again, of course, there's more examples here that the demonstrators weren't actually fighting for some kind of liberal democracy. They were actually fighting to restore the socialism of old, and they were jealous of peasants who were starting to make a lot more money than they were as intellectuals. And of course, the intellectual class is, as we know from Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard, that the intellectual class naturally supports a larger state because that's who they rely upon for their pay and money, and not the private sphere. Again, Raimondo says a 1988 survey, quote, showed that the average college graduate earned $9 per month less than those who had not gone to college, and this widely known fact energized much of the students' revolutionary fervor. What Ludwig von Mises called, quote, the anti-capitalistic mentality, so endemic among intellectuals who feel underappreciated and undervalued by the market economy, was clearly at work here. Chinese race riots. Another underreported aspect of the student movement and the Tiananmen protest of '89 was the politically incorrect racial aspect. While Chinese students were forced to live 6 or 8 to a room no bigger than a closet, foreign students sponsored by the Chinese government, primarily from Africa, were given relatively luxurious quarters and good food, all gratis. Anti-African protests broke out in the city of Hihai, ending in violence. Shouting anti-black slogans, the student militants rampaged through the Africans' dormitories, roughed up all foreigners, and besieged local authorities. Campus protests soon spread to Shanghai, Beijing, and elsewhere. Anti-foreign sentiment was a significant undercurrent of the Tiananmen Square rebellion. On April 19th, militants from the encampment marched on the living quarters of the top party leaders at the famous Zongnanhai compound. Screaming insults at Deng, they also yelled, "Kill the foreigners." As Li Feigon, an eyewitness sympathetic to the students, relates, quote, the police, in fact, seemed remarkably tolerant, appearing unflustered by the constant jeering and screaming. Many who watched doubted that the American Secret Service would have reacted so genially if a similar mob were battering on the gates of the White House in the middle of the night. This was carried to an extreme at about 2:30 a.m. when the police tried to clear the crowd, and some of them were pushed back onto a cluster of fallen bicycles. One tough picked up one of the bikes and smashed it over the head of one of the police. He was not arrested. Deng's Long March, another section by Raimondo. At the height of the Cultural Revolution, 1 million Red Guards had answered Chairman Mao's summons to assemble in Tiananmen Square and, quote, make revolution. The result had been a decade of turmoil and a great leap backward in terms of economic development. By the time Mao died, virtually all institutions of higher learning had been closed down, and in large parts of the country, industrial production could nearly ground to a halt. Agriculture was also seriously hampered. China could barely feed her starving millions. Deng personally suffered during this ultra-leftist interregnum. Not only was he stripped of his positions and banished to the countryside where he served in a, quote, work brigade, but he was denounced as, quote, China's number 2 capitalist roader. His son Deng Pufang was attacked by a mob of frenzied Red Guards and thrown out of a window at Beijing University. He was paralyzed from the waist down. The Cultural Revolution. The, quote, Gang of Four led by Madame Mao, the chairman's depraved and vicious wife, directed a reign of terror at Deng and many other longtime CCP veterans. A ruthless egalitarianism was enforced, and everyone in a position of authority or tainted by expertise was ruthlessly criticized until they confessed in public to being capitalist roaders. All material incentives were abolished, and instead, central planners counted on ideological zeal to boost industrial production. Thousands of years of Chinese culture were expunged as Red Guards smashed priceless artwork and looted ancient Buddhist monasteries in a relentless campaign against the, quote, ghosts and monsters of the feudal past. Madame Mao, in her youth a movie actress of minor repute, took a special interest in revolutionizing culture. The traditional Chinese opera was banned as a reactionary relic and replaced by a series of, quote, revolutionary operas. As the orgy of destruction reached its climax, Richard Nixon chose to make his rapprochement with the Beijing regime. The cementing of this alliance against the Soviet Union, signaled by his famous trip to the People's Republic, the cementing of this alliance against the Soviet Union, signaled by his famous trip to the People's Republic. While Clinton was regaled with displays of traditional Chinese culture at its most elaborate. Nixon's entertainment was confined to a performance of, quote, the Red Detachment of Women, one of Madame Mao's revolutionary ballads. So, of course, you have an interesting juxtaposition here of Richard Nixon in an incredibly important meeting with his rapprochement with the Chinese Communist Party was only he was only entertained by like a small performance of a revolutionary ballet that was incredibly unimpressive. While a few decades later, you have Clinton going to China after the Deng Xiaoping kind of the word is escaping me, but the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, and there's a stark difference between those two. While Clinton, after the reforms, is regaled with a huge, elaborate traditional Chinese cultural display. As British journalist James Pringle recalled, quote, Mao's sour-faced wife hosted Nixon at a rather grubby theater for the performance, and he smiled as she told him that the face on a target that the people's heroes were firing at was that of Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist Chinese dictator of Taiwan who still claimed over all of China, and who up until that moment had been our staunch ally. So very interesting. So a rightist wind. So Mao used the Red Guards to destroy his enemies in the party, but in the end he balked at turning over power to his wife and her coterie. As the country descended into chaos, Mao pulled back. The Red Guards were told to return to their universities and workplaces. The army was called in to quell the revolutionary fervor of the Maoist mobs, and the Cultural Revolution group that ran the party's propaganda machine was chastised by the chairman, if not yet silenced. With the ultra-leftists reined in, Mao called many of the purged rightists back into government service, Deng Xiaoping among them. Though the reformist group was reinstalled in the top leadership of the party by the rehabilitated Li Shaoqi, the hardline Maoists were still a threat to any hope of reform. The hardliners were still entrenched in many areas of the country, notably in Shanghai, Madame Mao's base of operations and traditionally a leftist stronghold. The death of Zhu Enlai. When Zhu died in 1976, an article appeared in a Shanghai newspaper accusing Zhu of having been a capitalist roader. The piece was widely interpreted as being a not-so-veiled attack on Deng. In late March, which is the time Chinese traditionally honor their dead ancestors, the Chinese people responded to the attacks by laying wreaths on public monuments honoring Zhu. 30 wreaths were hung in Tiananmen Square, and hundreds of thousands of demonstrators poured into the square. After 5 days during which the government was paralyzed by internal conflict, the police confronted the demonstrators. As many as 100 were killed and thousands arrested. Deng had reportedly been placed under house arrest even before the crackdown, and after the demonstrators were quashed, he was once again purged from the leadership, relieved of all his positions in the party and the government, and sent into internal exile. So again, the whole point, the point that Raimondo is trying to make here is trying to give the context for exactly the mindset that Deng Xiaoping was in when these students came through and tried to, in what Raimondo is portraying as trying to restart the days of Mao and to end these reforms and to reinstate what the old class of Chinese leadership of Chinese Communist Party leadership was, one that is more emblematic and represented in Chairman Mao's wife, who was even more of a leftist revolutionary than he was. And in what Mao had done was that he wanted to, in what Raimondo is saying, is that he had brought some of the rightists back into the party after the left wing was getting a bit more, like, way too carried away. And so having the rightists come back, Deng Xiaoping being among them, added some more balance to the party. And eventually the rightists won over and Deng Xiaoping became chairman. And so when the left student group tried to have a revolution of their own in the Tiananmen Square rebellion, maybe one of the reasons why Deng Xiaoping would have cracked down on it so hard is because he already knew the horrors of Mao's cultural revolution and didn't want to have any chance that his capitalist reforms would be undermined or brought all the way back to the days of Mao, when just absolute leftist terror would be taking over. So moreover, talking about all of this is not carrying water. Trying to be reform about and realistic about what happened at Tiananmen is not actually being a communist sympathizer, because the right wing of the party is actually more in control and was during Deng Xiaoping's days, and what he was doing was trying to prevent a leftist communist takeover. And again, this is the political compass of China at the time, so it's not like left and right are exactly the same, but not saying that Deng Xiaoping was exactly some kind of, I don't know, libertarian or any kind of American capitalist right winger or something like that. But at the time, in that time and place, he's more from the right, was part of Mao's right wing, brought in all these capitalist reforms, and now the students are coming and threatening to overturn that. So Deng triumphant, Raimondo concludes the column. But not for long. Mao's death and the downfall of the Gang of Four at the hands of the army soon returned Deng to power. Although he led China into a new era of modernization and economic development with an annual growth rate of nearly 10%, the bitter legacy of the Cultural Revolution was still fresh in Deng's mind. More than 20 years later, as the universities erupted once more, the man who had faced down Madame Mao and her fanatic Red Guards, and even replaced Mao as the great helmsman of the nation, was not about to turn the country over to this latest bunch of self-proclaimed student revolutionaries. Contrary to the myth of Red China as a monolithic political entity whose subjects marched in lockstep with an all-powerful communist regime, the history of the country since the 60s had been one of uninterrupted political turmoil. Deng, determined to build a prosperous China out of the ashes of Maoism, put a stop to it. When the students once again filled Tiananmen Square carrying portraits of Mao and calling for the overthrow of the government, he was determined that it would not happen again. This is the context of Chinese politics and history since the 60s, the Tiananmen Square insurrection of 89. So this was the context. In that context of Chinese politics and history since the 60s, the Tiananmen Square insurrection of 89 was a leftist, implicitly anti-capitalist reaction to Deng's program of economic reform, albeit one aided and abetted by radical reformists in the Communist Party itself. So, having kind of filibustered or destroyed that myth of a democratic liberal Tiananmen Square uprising and movement, Raimondo moves on. The new evil empire, and this is prophetic. In terms of sheer scope and mendacity, the propaganda campaign unleashed in this country, the United States, against China rivals anything cooked up by Madame Mao and her cohorts during the Cultural Revolution. While the Tiananmen Square myth is emblematic of the grotesque fiction concocted by the China bashers, their campaign to conjure a new yellow peril has concentrated on three major areas designed to appeal to the three major components of the anti-China coalition. 1. The military threat. The assertion that China represents a military threat to the United States is proof that no idea is so obviously erroneous that some alleged expert somewhere has not endorsed it. Unlike the US, China is cutting back on its defense spending. This is no longer true. Chinese military expenditures were reduced by 25% during the mid-80s, and since then the increases have fallen below the inflation rate. The 3 million man People's Liberation Army is half conscripts, equipped with hopelessly outdated weaponry and burdened by mind-boggling logistics problems. So this is no longer true, although the underlying point remains, right? That China is a regional power. It is not a power that threatens the United States. China is a threat. I've talked about this a lot on the show. So China is a threat to the American empire and American hegemony in China's near abroad. So China's surrounded by suspicious neighbors who don't want to see a resurgent China militarily and doesn't want China to project its power in its near abroad. Doesn't mean they're not trying to do so. But is this a threat to the United States, to the average people of the United States? I would say that the prospect of war with a nuclear armed country and the prospect of increased defense spending and the prospect of losing all of our cheap consumer goods and of China dumping American assets is more dangerous to the United States than any of China's military ambitions in their near abroad. So, number two, the hypocrisy and insincerity of the Republican warmongers in Congress who rail about Chinese nuclear missiles, supposedly aimed at American cities, was underscored by their response to the most substantial achievement of the Sino American Summit, the agreement by both parties to detarget their nukes. Everybody knows that they can be retargeted in a matter of minutes, was the Republicans' reply. But if that is so, then no agreement is worth anything, and we should go to war and be done with it. By this mad logic, a nuclear first strike against Beijing is justified on the grounds that it would eliminate long-range missiles that could at any moment be retargeted at American cities. So, of course, this isn't really applicable anymore, more of a relic of its time. Republicans accused Clinton of selling militarily sensitive satellite technology to the Chinese government in exchange for a few $100,000 in campaign contributions. The irony is that the real use of this technology is to launch communications satellites such as AsiaSat, which allows the growing number of Chinese satellite dishes aimed in its direction to bypass the state-controlled media and tune in to the worldwide buzz. In the name of anti-communism, these new Cold Warriors are willing to throw away the most powerful weapon in the anti-communist arsenal, which is exposure to world culture. So, here's the last little bit. And this might have something to do with the Falun Gong connection or the Uyghur connection as a parallel. The religious angle, China and Christianity. Pat Robertson has described the anti-China lobby gathering force among religious conservatives as, quote, morally irresponsible and politically ignorant. Few things bring people together like a common enemy, he writes. Quote, to some, China has done a masterful job of playing the villain. The China bashers prosper in direct mail and media campaigns, but they do not have the weight and righteousness on their righteousness on their side. This nails the Sinophobes' lobby for what it is, a cynical attempt to cash in on the gullibility of all too many conservatives who are sincere in their anti-communism but know next to nothing about China. William McGurn, editor of the Far Eastern Economic Review and for many years associated with the conservative National Review, said it best. While not arguing that Beijing has established freedom of religion, he writes, quote, when American critics declare that things are getting worse, it prompts the great unasked question, compared with what? The criticism now leveled by American Christian activists seems less a snapshot of China in the late 90s than a caricature drawn from the high days of Maoism a generation ago. Christian churches were closed during the Cultural Revolution, Bibles were forbidden, all religious proselytizing was banned, and believers were often imprisoned, tortured, and killed. Today, government-sanctioned patriotic churches, including Catholics and the various Protestant denominations, function openly. Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network has aired its programs over state-run television. While there has been some resistance on the part of local party officials to the cultural implications of China's opening up to the West, these are isolated incidents that go against the national trend. So, again, we need to, when we're comparing modern China when we're portraying modern China as a gigantic threat or a place that is not democratic or has human rights abuses, we really need to analyze those claims very closely, but also keep in mind what we're comparing those things to, right? Because if we're going to compare it to Maoist China during the Cultural Revolution, well, I mean, comparatively, China's doing incredibly well, and their human rights record is impeccable. Well, maybe not impeccable, compared to that time. Again, compared to that time. But, of course, their human rights record is much better now compared to the Cultural Revolution. and they've come a long way. China's long march toward capitalism and freedom is in danger of stalling. Capitalist roaders like Deng and his successors have had to face not only domestic enemies who long to restore Maoism, but enemies abroad intent on putting obstacles in their path. A new Cold War with China cast in the Soviet role would put China as well as much of the world on an altogether different road. And of course, that's the reason why I picked this column, which you can find in the show notes at libertyweekly.net/230, because it is so prophetic. We are currently right now in that new Cold War that Justin Raimondo talked about in 1999. And this is where you can get some of the much needed background, because as Raimondo writes in the last little bit here, of course, conservatives and people who may be good on some other things, like being anti-war or being against war with Russia, at least they have that, but they are so blinded by their hatred of communism that they know next to nothing about China and think that China is still a communist country. We're hearing the echoes of Red China. I mean, I've heard that all over the place. Red China this, the Chi-Coms that, things like that. So I wanted to share this column because it's prophetic and because I think we have a lot to glean from it. Also, there's a lot of libertarians who use the imagery from Tiananmen Square of the student protests, specifically the Tank Man, who don't really know exactly what happened there or know that they're really continuing on maybe the most famous like canard of U.S. propaganda against China, that these student protesters were some kind of freedom fighters who were believed in liberal democracy or believed in all of these Western values that the liberal rules-based world order is supposed to represent. And really, that's just not true. So, and again, we're talking a little bit about, Raimondo doesn't even talk about the number of people that died or doesn't deny that there was violence there. I'm not an expert in the Tiananmen Square incident. I'm not saying that no people died there or that, of course, people died there, but I'm not saying that the PLA is completely blameless in the situation. And I don't even know enough to dispute the numbers of people that died. And that's not what I'm going to do. I'm just saying that there were ample opportunities for the students to leave. They weren't ideologically pure in the sense that the Western media portrays them to be. That they may have provoked the soldiers, and of course that wouldn't excuse the soldiers killing these students. But there are records of students killing and citizens in Beijing killing the soldiers and mutilating their bodies. There is evidence of that. But I'm just trying to be clear that I'm not some kind of denialist or anything like that. That it does seem to be a very complicated situation, but there are alternative facts, an alternative narrative, and different evidence that should be weighed in one's mind. While I can't definitively say one way or the other, this is a side that is not really given nor understood or even known about by people who talk about China or who study China or think about Tiananmen Square. So really interesting thing to talk and think about. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you found it to be a different take, but a fair take as well. So again, libertyweekly.net/30. I'm Patrick McFarland. I'm the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org, where you can find podcasts by Scott Horton, Kyle Anzalone, Will Porter, and Connor Freeman, Conflicts of Interest. Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, Year Zero with Tommy Salmons, and you can find articles there by a great, excellent pen of writers we have over at the Institute, Kim Robinson and Lori Calhoun being among a great number of them. And you can support my work at libertyweekly.club. Sign up for the newsletter there. You get by email. There's free versions, but if you are a premium supporter, you get early access to episodes, and you also get bonus content and early access to my columns that I put out once a week, roughly, at the Libertarian Institute. All right. Again, libertyweekly.net/230. And really appreciate you guys listening. Sign up, subscribe, rate, review the podcast, do all those things. All right. Thanks. Peace.